Lana Rivers had always been meticulous when it came to choosing her home. As an architect with nearly 2 decades of experience designing commercial and residential properties, she knew exactly what to look for, not just in terms of aesthetics, but in the structural integrity, the land quality, and most importantly, the infrastructure. After her divorce, she had deliberately sought out a house that would allow her to be self-sufficient. She wanted something detached from unnecessary dependencies, a place where she could regain control over her life without having to answer to anyone. That was why she had chosen this particular home, a modest but elegant structure sitting on the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood, far enough from the main streets to avoid constant traffic noise but close enough to essential amenities. What truly sold her, however, was the fact that the property came with its own water filtration system and private reservoir. The house was not connected to municipal water, meaning she would never have to worry about fluctuating water bills, restrictive regulations, or the arbitrary decisions of a neighborhood board. She had invested thousands into upgrading the system, making sure it was up to modern standards, ensuring that she would always have access to clean water without interference. It was a decision she had made, deliberately one that gave her peace of mind. The first few weeks after moving in were quiet, exactly as she had hoped. Her new neighbors were polite but mostly kept to themselves, which suited her perfectly. Lana had no interest in ingratiating herself into the local social circles, nor did she feel the need to participate in whatever minor suburban dramas might arise. Her work kept her busy enough, and in her free time she preferred the solitude of her home, the satisfaction of working on personal renovation projects, and the serenity of her backyard garden. She had started to believe that perhaps for once she had made the right decision until the first unexpected knock at her door shattered that illusion. It was early in the evening when she opened the door and found Karen Pearson standing on her porch. Middle-aged, with precisely styled hair and a carefully curated appearance that exuded a mix of self-importance and suburban superiority, Karen introduced herself as the neighborhood's community coordinator. The title was vague, but her tone carried an unmistakable authority, as if she expected Lana to immediately recognize and acknowledge her position. Lana had met people like her before, women who thrived on quiet control, who wielded bureaucracy like a weapon, who masked dominance under the guise of ensuring harmony. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Lana," Karen said with an artificial warmth, her eyes scanning Lana's front yard, noting every detail. "I wanted to personally stop by and introduce myself, and of course let you know how things work around here. We're a very tight-knit community. We like to ensure that everything runs smoothly, and that everyone contributes to keeping our neighborhood unified." Lana could already sense where the conversation was heading. She had barely been here a month, and she had already done her due diligence. There was no official homeowners association governing this neighborhood, but there were influential figures who clearly believed they had the power to enforce their own set of rules. "I appreciate that," Lana replied, keeping her voice neutral. Karen smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I couldn't help but notice that your property isn't connected to the water supply," she continued. "It's a bit unusual, considering we all share the same system. There are maintenance fees, of course, and infrastructure costs that we all contribute to." Lana's jaw tightened. "I have my own well and reservoir. My system is fully independent." Karen's smile faltered for just a second before she regained composure. "Oh, I see. Well, that's interesting. You know, we believe that a community should function as a unit. Individuality is admirable, but when it disrupts the balance of shared responsibility, it can create unnecessary complications." Lana knew exactly what she was trying to do: passive coercion, the first step in establishing dominance. She wasn't going to engage. "Fortunately, my setup doesn't interfere with anyone else's," she said calmly. Karen let out a small, practiced laugh. Of course. Just something to consider. Sometimes independent systems can fail, and relying on our shared infrastructure could be beneficial. But I won't keep you. I just wanted to extend my welcome. Oh, and by the way..." Her voice lowered slightly, conspiratorially, We like to keep our properties looking consistent. Aesthetic cohesion is very important to maintaining the value of the neighborhood. Lana merely nodded, not bothering to ask what exactly that implied. She didn't need Karen's approval. For the next week, she thought nothing of the interaction, chalking it up to nothing more than an overbearing neighbor trying to assert her influence. It wasn't the first time she had dealt with someone like Karen, and it wouldn't be the last. She continued her routine, going about her life as usual until she noticed something strange about her water pressure. One morning, while washing her hands, she realized that the flow was weaker than usual. It wasn't significant, but it was noticeable. Initially, she assumed it was an issue with the pump or a minor maintenance problem. She made a mental note to check it later and went on with her day. But over the next 48 hours, the pressure steadily declined. By the third morning, it had weakened to the point where water barely trickled from her faucets. Lana immediately went to inspect her system. She checked the well pump, the filtration setup, the connections, everything appeared intact, yet something was clearly wrong. Deciding not to take any chances, she called in a technician to inspect it professionally. When the technician arrived, he spent nearly an hour inspecting the system before emerging from the pump house with a grim expression. "You're not going to like this," he said. Lana crossed her arms, already bracing herself. "What is it?" "Your main supply line has been cut," he said. "And not just damaged, it was deliberately severed." Lana's stomach dropped. "What?" He nodded toward the area behind the well where the piping ran underground toward her house. "Somebody dug into the ground and sliced right through your pipes. Not an accident. It was done cleanly with a saw. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing." Lana's mind raced. Who would have done this? Why? And how had they even known where to cut? Then, as if on cue, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching her driveway. She turned, and there, standing with a folder tucked neatly under her arm and a satisfied expression on her face, was Karen Pearson. "Looks like we have a problem, Lana," she said smoothly. "I just came by to let you know that, since you're currently without water, we've generously gone ahead and connected your property to our shared system for your convenience." "Of course." Lana stared at her, stunned. Karen smiled. "Naturally, this means you'll be receiving a water bill from now on. But don't worry, we'll make sure to keep it reasonable." For the first time since moving in, Lana felt real anger rise in her chest. She had known Karen was intrusive. She had suspected she would try to manipulate her. But this? This was something else entirely. And it was only the beginning. Lana stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what she had just heard. Karen's voice carried the kind of casual authority that made it clear she didn't expect resistance. She was delivering a decision, not a suggestion. The folder she held was likely filled with fabricated paperwork, false approvals, and whatever justification she had concocted to make this outrageous move seem legitimate. Lana had encountered people like her before, people who operated under the assumption that they had already won before the other party even realized they were in a fight. Karen tilted her head slightly, as if waiting for Lana to say something, but she wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of an immediate reaction. Instead, she forced herself to take a slow breath, pushing down the surge of anger threatening to cloud her judgment. The technician was still standing nearby, shifting uncomfortably as he realized he had walked into something much bigger than a simple plumbing issue. Lana turned back to him. "Can you show me exactly where the line was cut?" she asked, ignoring Karen completely. The technician hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Yeah, follow me." She walked past Karen without a word, feeling the woman's eyes on her as she moved. The cut in the pipe was behind her well house, partially buried beneath disturbed dirt, as if someone had tried to cover up what they had done. The soil was loose, indicating the work had been recent. Whoever had done this hadn't even bothered to make it look like an accident. "It's a clean cut," the technician said, crouching down and running his fingers along the exposed piping. "Not like it cracked from pressure or age. Someone came in with a saw and sliced straight through. And it wasn't a random job. They knew where to dig." That part sent a chill down Lana's spine. The well system was located in a fenced-off section of her backyard, hidden from view unless someone specifically knew what they were looking for. It wasn't something that just anyone would have stumbled upon. Someone had planned this. Someone had walked onto her property, cut off her water supply, and then, with audacity she could barely comprehend, had taken it upon themselves to reconnect her home to a water system she had deliberately opted out of. When she straightened, Karen was still standing there, watching with a faint smile. "This is illegal," Lana said flatly. "Oh, come now," Karen said lightly, stepping closer. "It's just a matter of practicality. You were disconnected, we fixed the problem. Honestly, you should be thanking us." Lana clenched her fists. "You trespassed on my property, vandalized my system, and made a change without my consent. That's not fixing a problem, that's creating one." Karen's expression remained pleasant, but there was a distinct sharpness in her gaze now. "You seem to be under the impression that you have a choice in this matter. The reality is, we all contribute to the upkeep of the neighborhood. We all share resources. Your little independent setup might have worked for a while, but it's simply not in line with how we do things here. I don't care how you do things. My house isn't part of your system, and I never agreed to any of this." Karen's smile didn't waver, but there was something unsettling in how calm she was, how completely unaffected by Lana's refusal. It was the confidence of someone who had already maneuvered everything into place. "Well," she said, adjusting the folder under her arm, "that's where you're mistaken." Lana felt something cold settle in her stomach as Karen casually opened the folder and pulled out a sheet of paper. She held it out, and when Lana snatched it from her hands, she immediately saw what Karen wanted her to see. It was a document with her name on it, a formal request for connection to the shared water system. A signature was scrawled at the bottom, her signature. Except it wasn't hers. Lana felt her breath slow, her grip tightening on the paper. The signature was a careless forgery, not even an attempt at an accurate match, but the document itself looked official enough that it could easily pass with the right people. "You falsified my request?" Lana said, her voice low and dangerous. Karen made a soft, dismissive noise. "It's just a technicality. We needed proper documentation to process the connection, and I knew you'd be reasonable about it once you saw the benefits. You're an intelligent woman, Lana. Surely you understand that fighting this is just a waste of time." Lana's mind raced. Karen hadn't expected her to push back, at least not effectively. She had likely been banking on the idea that Lana would be too caught off guard, too overwhelmed by the suddenness of it all, to react in any meaningful way. Maybe Karen thought she would accept the change out of frustration, or maybe she assumed Lana wouldn't have the energy to deal with the bureaucracy required to fight it. But Karen didn't know who she was dealing with. Lana took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. Karen didn't move, but her smile faltered for the briefest fraction of a second. "I'm calling my lawyer," Lana said quietly. Karen's smile returned, but it was thinner now, stretched over something brittle. "Of course," she said. "But while you're doing that, you might want to check your mail. Your first water bill should be arriving any day now." Lana didn't respond. She simply turned on her heel, walking past the technician, past the severed pipe, past the boundary where Karen had crossed a line she had no business crossing. She barely heard Karen's parting words, something about community and responsibility, because she was already focused on what came next. By the time she reached her front door, she knew exactly what she had to do. First, she documented everything. She took photos of the severed pipe, of the disturbed dirt, of the forged document Karen had handed her. She called the water department, demanding an immediate audit of her account. Then she called her bank, ensuring that no automatic payments would be processed under her name if Karen had been bold enough to forge one document. There was no telling what else she had tampered with. And finally, she called her lawyer. Michael Daniels was a no-nonsense attorney she had worked with before on past projects. He picked up on the second ring. "Lana," he said. "What's wrong?" She exhaled sharply. "I have a problem. By the time she finished explaining, there was a brief pause on the other end. "Send me everything," Michael said. "Photos, documents, every piece of evidence you have. I'll start working on this immediately." Lana felt something settle inside her, a cold, hard determination. Karen had made her move. Now it was her turn. Lana had woken up that morning with a sense of unease, a lingering tension from the events of the previous day that refused to fade. She had always trusted her instincts, and right now they were screaming at her that this situation was far from over. She had spent the night combing through the evidence, documenting everything: the photos of her severed pipe, the email from the water department confirming the fraudulent transfer, the falsified signature on the paperwork that Karen had so smugly handed her. But even with all of that laid out before her, she knew that dealing with a system designed to move at a glacial pace meant that resolution wouldn't come easily. Bureaucracy wasn't built for speed, and people like Karen knew how to exploit that to their advantage. The longer it took to untangle this mess, the harder it would be to undo what had already been done. She was halfway through her morning coffee when her phone buzzed with an email notification. The subject line was deceptively harmless: service confirmation notice. The body of the message, however, was anything but. "Dear MS Rivers, we are pleased to confirm the successful transition of your property to our municipal water system, as per your request. Your first bill will be processed within the next billing cycle. Should you require any adjustments, please contact our office." Lana gritted her teeth as she read the words again, feeling the rage coil tight in her chest. There was no mention of the fraudulent nature of the request, no acknowledgement that she had already disputed it. As far as they were concerned, this was final. She dialed the customer service number without hesitation, pacing the length of her kitchen as she waited for someone to pick up. The hold music was a grating loop of soft jazz, and every passing second only fueled her frustration. After nearly 20 minutes, a voice finally came through the line. "This is Marcus with customer support. How can I assist you today?" Lana forced herself to keep her tone steady. "I just received an email confirming a water service transition that I never requested. There's been a mistake, and I need it corrected immediately." There was a pause as the man on the other end of the line typed something into his system. "Can I get your address?" She gave it to him, listening as he hummed under his breath while scanning the records. When he finally spoke again, his tone had shifted, more careful now. "I see the request here. It was processed 2 days ago through the community liaison." Lana's stomach twisted. There it was again, that vague, infuriating title. "Who exactly is the community liaison?" "I can't disclose that information," he said, the words automatic rehearsed. She exhaled slowly through her nose, trying to keep her temper in check. "Let me make this very clear. Someone forged my name on a document and submitted a request that I never authorized. That is fraud. If you don't correct this immediately, I'll be taking legal action." The man hesitated. "I understand your concern, but once a service transfer is finalized, it requires formal review before any changes can be made." "How long does that review take?" "Typically 6 to 8 weeks. Lana closed her eyes, gripping the edge of the counter to keep herself from throwing her phone across the room. Of course, the system was designed to make reversals as difficult as possible. They had locked her into a forced transition, and even though she had proof of fraud, the wheels of bureaucracy would turn at their usual sluggish pace while she was left footing the bill. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. "Fine. Then let me be absolutely clear: I will not be paying a single cent toward this fraudulent service. If your department attempts to bill me, you'll be hearing from my attorney." She ended the call before he could respond, her pulse hammering in her ears. She needed to warn Michael. Her lawyer picked up after the second ring, his voice calm but laced with concern as she recounted everything. When she was done, he let out a slow exhale. "They're trying to box you in. They know how long it takes to dispute these kinds of changes. And they're banking on you either getting frustrated enough to accept it or being legally stuck long enough that you end up paying out of necessity. Lana already knew that. So what do? We'll file a fraud report, but in the meantime, you need to document every single interaction. Keep copies of every email, every letter, every bill they send you. Don't respond to anything without going through me first. And under no circumstances should you make a payment. If they try to enforce this, we'll use it as evidence of willful manipulation. She agreed, and after hanging up, she immediately began scanning every document into a digital file, backing it up in multiple locations. But even as she tried to focus on the logistics, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. That suspicion was confirmed later that afternoon when an unexpected knock sounded at her door. Lana's breath hitched. She hadn't been expecting anyone, and after everything that had already happened, she wasn't in the mood for surprises. She opened the door to find two men in reflective vests standing on her porch, clipboards in hand. "MS Rivers?" one of them asked. She didn't answer immediately. "Who are you?" The man closest to her adjusted his clipboard. "We're with the neighborhood maintenance team. We've been asked to conduct an inspection of your plumbing system." Lana's grip tightened on the doorframe. By whom? The community liaison. That phrase again. The vague manufactured authority that Karen had so clearly embedded herself within. "You're not inspecting anything," she said flatly. The man frowned. "Ma'am, it's a routine check. We just need to verify that your new connection is functioning properly." "I didn't authorize a new connection. And unless you have a court order, you're not stepping foot on my property." The second man exchanged a glance with his colleague, then nodded. "Understood. We'll mark it as inaccessible and report back." She watched as they walked back to their truck, every muscle in her body coiled with tension. She knew exactly what they were doing. If she had let them in, they would have found a reason to declare her independent system non-compliant, unsafe, or unregulated. It would have been the final step in forcing her to submit. This wasn't just about control. This was about erasure. Karen didn't just want Lana to use the shared water system. She wanted her to accept it, to comply, to forget she had ever been independent in the first place. That night, Lana didn't sleep. Instead, she reinforced the locks on her gates, ordered security cameras, and made sure that every inch of her property was monitored. If they came back, if they tried anything else, she would have proof. But even as she set up the cameras, even as she checked the locks one last time before heading inside, she knew that this wasn't over. She didn't just need to fight back. She needed to win. Lana barely slept that night. Even though her house was locked up, her gates reinforced, and the new security cameras actively recording, the feeling of being under siege refused to let her rest. She had lived through stressful situations before, deadlines that pushed her to exhaustion, legal disputes over construction permits, and the slow unraveling of her marriage, but none of those had ever left her with this kind of gnawing dread. This was something different. It wasn't just an administrative nightmare or a bureaucratic inconvenience. It was a deliberate attack, an orchestrated attempt to force her into submission through manipulation, deceit, and intimidation. And the worst part was that whoever was behind it knew exactly how to exploit the system to make it as difficult as possible for her to fight back. By morning, she had already drafted an email to Michael, attaching screenshots of her security footage from the previous day. The video showed the two men in vests standing at her door, attempting to gain access under the pretense of an inspection. There was no official paperwork. No warrants, just two strangers trying to force their way into her home under the authority of a title that meant absolutely nothing outside of the power Karen had given herself. Lana knew she had made the right call in refusing them, but it still left her shaken. If they were bold enough to show up at her door, what would they try next? She didn't have to wait long to find out. By noon, she received another email from the water department, this one less of a confirmation and more of a warning. "Dear Ms. Rivers, our records indicate that your recent transition to municipal water services has not yet been finalized due to lack of on-site inspection approval. Please be advised that failure to comply with mandatory system evaluations may result in penalties and service restrictions. If an inspection is not scheduled within the next 5 business days, a non-compliance report will be filed. Lana read it twice, bile rising in her throat. They weren't just pushing her into their system, they were trying to trap her into a violation she never agreed to. If she refused their forced connection, they could mark her as non-compliant, which, given how these bureaucracies worked, could spiral into fines, threats of property liens, or even legal action. She immediately called Michael. "They're escalating," she said as soon as he picked up. "I just saw your email," he said. "I was going to call you. This isn't just about money anymore. They're trying to build a legal case against you." Lana squeezed the bridge of her nose. "How?" "They want to force you into a situation where you're officially labeled as refusing access to required municipal services. If they establish that, they can start issuing fines, then use those unpaid fines as grounds to take more aggressive action: property violations, debt collections, potentially even foreclosure threats. They're creating a paper trail to make you the problem." The sheer weight of what he was saying hit her all at once. It wasn't enough that they had tried to force her into their system, they were now setting her up to be penalized for resisting. This wasn't just fraud anymore. It was an entire web of coercion designed to grind her down until she either caved or lost everything trying to fight it. "What's our next move?" she asked, forcing her voice to stay level. "I'm filing an injunction today," Michael said, "that will legally freeze any further action on their part until we can bring your case before a judge. In the meantime, do not engage with them directly. If anyone shows up at your house again, do not let them in, do not sign anything," and the sound of a car pulling into her driveway cut him off. Lana turned, her stomach twisting as she saw a black SUV parked just outside her gate. It was the kind of vehicle that screamed corporate authority, the type of car used by executives who needed to project power without saying a word. "Michael," she said carefully, keeping her eyes locked on the vehicle, "I think we have company." "Who is it?" "I don't know yet. Stay on the line." She stepped onto her porch just as the driver's side door opened. A man in his mid-50s climbed out, dressed in a crisp gray suit with an air of controlled indifference. He adjusted his tie before shutting the door, then began walking toward her gate with the practiced ease of someone who expected doors to open for him. Lana folded her arms. "Can I help you?" The man stopped just short of the gate, offering a small, tight-lipped smile. "Miss Rivers, my name is Robert Calloway. I represent the Regional Infrastructure Board." The name meant nothing to her. "And what exactly does the Regional Infrastructure Board want with me?" Calloway's smile didn't falter. "I understand there's been some confusion regarding your recent transition to municipal services. I wanted to personally ensure that everything is handled smoothly and without unnecessary complications." "Lana didn't move? You mean the transition I never authorized?" Calloway exhaled softly, tilting his head in a gesture of practiced sympathy. "These types of adjustments can sometimes cause initial resistance. I completely understand. Change is often difficult, but I assure you this is ultimately in your best interest." Lana had heard this tone before. It was the same calculated condescension that people in power used when they wanted to make it clear that resistance was futile. It was a voice designed to disarm, to make the target feel unreasonable for objecting to something they had every right to oppose. "You trespassed on my property," she said evenly. "You falsified my authorization, and now you're trying to penalize me for not accepting a system I never opted into. That's not a transition. That's fraud." Calloway didn't blink. "Ms. Rivers, I assure you, no one is attempting to defraud you. There was simply a clerical misunderstanding." "You think forgery is a clerical misunderstanding?" His smile thinned. "I think it's a lot easier for everyone involved if we move forward amicably. Legal battles are expensive, so is refusing mandatory compliance with municipal ordinances. There it was. The real threat buried under the corporate pleasantries. They didn't expect her to fight back. They expected her to get tired, to get scared, to give up before it ever reached a courtroom. Lana took a slow step forward. Tell Karen that I'm not going anywhere. And tell her that I'm not paying for a single drop of water that she thinks she owns. For the first time, Calloway's expression flickered. A slight shift in his stance, a momentary tightening of his jaw. It lasted barely a second before he composed himself, nodding once. I sincerely hope it doesn't come to that, he said, turning back toward his SUV. Have a good afternoon, MS. Rivers. She didn't move until he was gone. When she finally lifted the phone back to her ear, Michael was still there. They're scared, he said. Lana exhaled. Not scared enough. Not yet, Michael corrected. But they will be. As she walked back inside, a new kind of determination settled in her chest. They had made their move. Now it was time for hers. Lana knew that the moment Robert Calloway walked away from her property, the real fight had begun. His visit hadn't been a courtesy call or an attempt at negotiation. It had been a warning, a polite but unmistakable message that she was expected to fall in line. But the moment he realized she wouldn't, his demeanor had shifted just enough for her to see it for what it was, an attempt to intimidate her into submission. That meant they were running out of easy options. They had spent the last 2 weeks manipulating records, falsifying documents, and trying to trap her in a legal mess she never agreed to. But now that she was actively pushing back, they would need to escalate in ways that couldn't be hidden behind bureaucratic processes. She had seen it before in corporate battles. When paperwork and loopholes failed, people started getting desperate. That thought was still weighing on her when she stepped outside the next morning and saw the notice posted on her front gate. The large, bold lettering made her stomach twist before she even read the details. Notice of property violation. Her eyes scanned the document, bile rising in her throat as she absorbed the carefully worded accusations. According to the notice, her private water system was now considered a non-compliant infrastructure hazard, and if she did not rectify the situation within the next 14 days, she could face fines, enforced property modifications, or if necessary an involuntary reassessment of her land use rights. She had barely finished reading when she heard a voice behind her. Unfortunate, isn't it? Lana turned slowly, already knowing who she would see. Karen Pearson stood at the edge of the sidewalk, hands clasped in front of her. Rainucci. Dressed in her usual meticulously pressed beige slacks and a cardigan that practically screamed reasonable middle-class authority. The smile she wore was almost sympathetic, as if she were addressing someone who had simply been too stubborn to understand what was best for them. Lana folded her arms. You're getting sloppy, she said flatly. Karen blinked, feigning innocence. Whatever do you mean? Lana tapped the notice. This isn't even creative. If you're going to fabricate violations, at least try to make them sound legitimate. Karen tilted her head. Oh, but it is legitimate. The new inspection report flagged your system as outdated and environmentally inefficient. You wouldn't want to be responsible for groundwater contamination, would you? Lana's fingers dug into the paper. There was no inspection. Karen sighed, shaking her head. You really should have let the maintenance team in when they came by. But I understand you were feeling defensive. Now, unfortunately, the matter has been escalated, and this will have to go through official channels. At this point, the best course of action would be to comply. I know you want to keep fighting, but really, is it worth the trouble? Lana took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. You seem to think that just because you filed a fraudulent complaint, I'll have no choice but to accept it. You forget that I have something you don't. Actual documentation proving this is a private system, legally installed, fully up to code, and registered before your fabricated ordinances ever existed. Karen didn't flinch. I wouldn't be so confident. The moment something is flagged as non-compliant, it opens the door for reevaluation. Codes change. MS Rivers. Policies shift. What was once acceptable may no longer be in the interest of public safety. Lana clenched her jaw. That was the game they were playing now. If they couldn't force her into their system outright, they would move the goalposts until they could declare her in violation of regulations that hadn't even existed when she installed her infrastructure. Karen smiled as if reading her thoughts. I would advise handling this quietly. Legal disputes can be exhausting, and let's be honest, this is hardly worth the stress, is it? Lana felt something cold settle in her chest. Karen wasn't just trying to win, she was trying to wear her down, to break her resolve before it ever reached the courts. You know what? Lana said, forcing a calmness she didn't feel. I think I will handle this quietly. Karen's smile flickered just slightly. Good. I knew you'd come to your senses. Lana returned her smile, but there was nothing friendly about it. Oh, I don't mean quietly in the way you want me to. I mean quietly as in while my lawyer and I compile every illegal action you and your friends have taken and prepare to dismantle whatever leverage you think you have. For the first time, Karen's mask cracked. The amusement in her eyes dimmed, and something colder settled behind them. It lasted only a second before she recovered, but Lana had seen it, and that was all she needed. She turned without another word, walking back toward her house, leaving Karen standing by the sidewalk. The notice crumpled in her hand as she stepped inside, her mind already racing through the next steps. Michael was on speakerphone within minutes. They're doubling down, she said. I saw the new complaint. It's complete nonsense. They're trying to change the rules to force me into compliance. Michael exhaled sharply. That means they're out of options. That's good news for us. Lana let out a short, humorless laugh. Good news? It means we're close to something they don't want us to find. Lana frowned. What do you mean? I did some digging, Michael said. This isn't just about you. This same exact tactic has been used in other neighborhoods, independent homeowners suddenly finding themselves caught in manufactured violations, forced into compliance, their property rights eroded piece by piece. There's a pattern. And I'm willing to bet Karen isn't the one at the top of this. Lana's grip tightened on her phone. So who is? That's what I'm working on. Lana took a slow breath, steadying herself. What do we do now? We hit them where it hurts. You're filing a formal challenge against the property violation notice. That means they'll have to prove in court that your system is non-compliant, and since we have the original permits and records, they won't be able to. The moment they lose credibility on that front, we turn the attention back on them, investigate the forged water service request, the fraudulent billing, and now the attempted regulatory manipulation. Lana felt something shift inside her, a slow burning determination overtaking the exhaustion. They're expecting you to roll over, Michael continued. The worst thing you can do to people like this is prove them wrong. Lana stared at the crumpled notice in her hand, then smoothed it out against the countertop. They think I'll give up, she murmured. Michael's voice was steady. Then let's make sure they regret thinking that. Lana set the notice down, her decision made. They had played their hand. Now it was her turn. The morning of the hearing arrived gray and windless, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Lana stood in front of the courthouse in a charcoal coat, hair tied back with precision, her expression unreadable. This wasn't about theatrics or posturing, it was about control, and reclaiming it from people who had tried to tear it from her piece by piece. For weeks they had thrown everything they had at her. Falsified documents, fake inspections, fabricated violations, and veiled threats, all designed to destabilize her. But she had held her ground, methodically, rationally, with the exact precision she applied to her work. The only difference was this wasn't a design she could walk away from. It was her home, her life, and she had no intention of losing either to a woman who treated control like currency. Michael met her at the courthouse steps, a thick binder in his hands, face calm but focused. He had the composure of someone who had walked into courtrooms like this dozens of times before and walked out with the facts still intact. What made him different from the paper pushers Lana had dealt with in city planning boards was that he didn't bluff, and he never underestimated the power of subtle threats when backed by real evidence. He handed her a copy of the key documents without a word, and they walked inside together. The hearing room wasn't a dramatic courtroom with gallery seating and a judge in robes. It was sterile and administrative, a long conference table, uncomfortable chairs, and a panel of 3 officials seated across from them, each holding a laptop, each wearing the strained look of government functionaries used to mediating disputes that were more annoying than important. But this wasn't a petty disagreement over fence height or paint colors. This was about fraud, forced compliance, and the misuse of regulatory authority. On the other side of the room sat Karen. She had brought her own representative, a sharp-eyed man in a tailored navy suit, who introduced himself as a municipal compliance advisor. His voice was smooth, his manner polished, but his eyes never stayed still. He kept glancing between the panel and the documents in front of him, as if willing them to do his job for him. Karen, for her part, looked like a portrait of perfect composure. She wore a soft pastel blouse and a pearl necklace, her expression warm, almost amused. It was the same look she had given Lana the day she stood outside her gate and pretended that everything she was doing was somehow for the greater good. The hearing began with procedural introductions and a brief summary of the case, read aloud in a monotone voice by the lead official. Lana listened without flinching as the summary included the original complaint filed against her, accusations that her water system posed a hazard, that she had refused inspection, that she had interfered with utility coordination. It was surreal hearing her own life twisted into bureaucratic language that made it sound like she was the one causing chaos, not responding to it. But she said nothing. That part was for Michael. When it was their turn, he stood and began with a quiet authority that commanded immediate attention. There was no anger in his voice, no aggression. He didn't need it. He had facts. He started with the original blueprints and installation permits for Lana's private water system documents that clearly showed the system had been fully legal, approved by the city 5 years prior, and updated to meet current safety standards. Then came the utility usage logs, which confirmed there had been no service request or transition to municipal supply until the disputed request appeared. That was followed by a notarized statement from Lana's former contractor verifying that no work had been done to connect her system to the grid. Then Michael dropped the core of their argument on the table, the forged service request document, complete with the incorrect signature and the metadata from the scan file showing it had originated from the same IP address used by Karen's administrative email. There was a beat of silence as the panel digested that. Michael didn't push. He let the weight of that evidence settle before moving on to the footage time-stamped, high-resolution clips from Lana's security system showing unknown men attempting to access her property, followed by the posting of the violation notice the very next day. The advisor representing Karen tried to object, of course. He claimed that the forgery was unproven, that the footage only showed confusion, not misconduct, and that the water connection was a community initiative misunderstood by one homeowner. But it fell flat. The documents had timestamps. The metadata had IP addresses. The signature on the request form didn't match any previous documents Lana had ever signed, and the panel knew it. Karen didn't speak. She sat with her arms crossed, gaze fixed forward, but Lana could feel the tension radiating from her. For once, she wasn't in control. She couldn't redirect the narrative or twist someone's words to her advantage. This was evidence, not gossip, and it wasn't going away. The final blow came when Michael presented the most recent discovery, an internal email leaked by a disillusioned employee from the water department, and stating that several service requests had been pre-authorized, based on recommendations from community liaisons to fast-track integration of outlying properties. It was vague, intentionally so, but the email specifically mentioned Lana's address and included a CC'd recipient, Karen Pearson. The panel recessed for deliberation, and the room went quiet except for the shuffling of papers and the muted clicks of keyboards. Karen didn't look at Lana. She just sat there as composed as ever, but Lana saw the twitch in her jaw, the way her knuckles had gone white against the edge of the table. She was calculating now, trying to figure out how much damage had been done and how much of it could still be contained. When the panel returned, their spokesperson read the decision without ceremony. The violation notice was dismissed. The service request was declared fraudulent and void. An investigation would be opened into the misuse of authority within the utility office, and all associated penalties, fees, and charges imposed on MS servers were to be formally withdrawn. Lana didn't smile. She didn't speak. She didn't look at Karen. She just nodded once, slowly, and gathered her documents. Outside, the air felt different. Not lighter, not yet, but clearer. Michael walked beside her, flipping the binder shut as they descended the courthouse steps. "It's not over," he said. "I know. But it's a start." Lana looked out over the street, cars drifting by in ordinary silence, as if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis. Karen had pushed too far, and for once the system had cracked in the right direction. There would be more. She could feel it. People like Karen didn't vanish quietly, and whoever had backed her moves from the shadows wouldn't take this loss without retaliation. But Lana had already made peace with that. She had fought the first battle, and she had won. The days following the hearing passed in a state of cautious quiet. Lana didn't celebrate. There were no victory toasts, no social media posts, no late-night conversations about justice or vindication. She simply returned home, walked through her front door, and locked it behind her like she always did. The house was unchanged, its walls still firm, its windows clear, its garden undisturbed, but it no longer felt like the backdrop to a battle. For the first time in weeks, it felt like home again. And this time, not because it was untouched by others, but because she had fought to keep it that way and won. The official letters began arriving 2 days later. One from the water department, formally retracting the transition of her property and acknowledging the illegality of the forged authorization. Another from the Municipal Inspection Bureau, confirming that her private system was not only compliant but listed in the regional database as exempt from integration mandates due to her early permits and a self-sustaining infrastructure. They included an apology, carefully worded and legally sterile, but real enough in tone that Lana knew someone in that office was terrified of being held liable. But it was the third letter, printed on pale blue paper and hand-delivered by a courier, that made her pause. It came from the Office of Civil Regulatory Ethics and Oversight, a division of the state-level municipal governance board. It wasn't long. Just 3 paragraphs, stating that Karen Pearson and her representative had been placed under formal investigation for exceeding administrative authority and for coordinating unauthorized actions without public mandate, and for participating in a pattern of falsified procedural requests in multiple neighborhoods. Lana's case had triggered a wider audit, and while they couldn't disclose the full extent of what they had uncovered, they were already preparing internal disciplinary action and considering referral for criminal prosecution. They would not require her further participation, but they thanked her for her cooperation and commend the fortitude with which you defended your rights under increasingly coercive pressure. She read the last sentence 3 times, not because she needed to, but because something about it felt surreal. There were no exclamation points, no bolded language, no media fanfare, just quiet acknowledgement. That was fine. That was enough. The 4th letter she expected. It came from Karen herself, and it wasn't handwritten or personal. It was a legal release. A document stating that Karen Pearson was resigning from all positions of local community coordination, not forfeiting any administrative responsibilities or rights associated with community-level infrastructure representation, and agreeing to a standing no-contact condition between her and Lana, effective immediately. The wording made it sound like a mutual agreement. It wasn't. It was a formal surrender signed under pressure, but Lana didn't care. She signed her end of the document, had it notarized, and sent it back the same day. That door was closed. The community changed almost overnight. Karen's name vanished from the flyers on the public board by the neighborhood park. The whiteboard outside the old community center no longer listed maintenance days or volunteer rosters. A new figure stepped into the coordination role, someone who introduced himself to Lana once via a brief letter of introduction, but otherwise stayed far away from her gate. The neighbors, once cold or evasive under Karen's influence, had begun to shift in demeanor. No apologies, but nods in passing, acknowledgments without words. She didn't need more than that. She reinstated her full water system, installing new pressure regulators, backup filters, and a lockable panel over her reservoir control switch. The damage to the pipe behind the well had been professionally repaired, the trench filled and tamped. This time the technician didn't just install it, he added reinforced housing, a steel cover, and buried a tamper sensor in the soil, set to alert her phone the second it was disturbed. Not paranoia. Preparation. She didn't install barbed wire. She didn't mount new cameras every 15 feet. She didn't retreat into isolation or dig herself a moat. She didn't have to, because the threat was gone. 1 week after the resolution, Michael came by. He didn't come in a suit, and he didn't bring a briefcase. Just a plain folder and 2 cups of black coffee. They sat in her kitchen as sunlight poured through the window over the sink, and he laid the last document in front of her, a settlement check, issued by the county on behalf of the Oversight Division. It wasn't huge, just enough to cover her legal fees, the repair to her system, and the time she'd lost navigating the labyrinth someone else had tried to trap her in. She stared at it for a moment, then pushed it aside. "I don't want the money," she said. Michael didn't argue. He just nodded and placed it back in the folder. "She's done," he said after a pause. "They're gutting her professionally. No more positions. No ability to administrate. She's barred from filing any municipal recommendations for the next 10 years, and from participating in any development initiatives across the region." Lana nodded. "And the criminal side?" "Pending. But with the leak we found and the IP trail from the forged forms, they've got enough to build the case. Even if she walks, she won't walk far." Lana looked out the window. Her garden was blooming again. The reservoir cover gleamed in the morning sun. The cameras were quiet, still but vigilant. The gate remained closed, but not because she feared the world beyond it, just because she finally could choose when to open it. "She tried to turn the system into a weapon," she said. Michael sipped his coffee. "And you turned the system against her." "No, I just proved it wasn't hers to control." He smiled at that, a small, rare smile that lasted just long enough to feel honest. He left soon after, and Lana spent the rest of the day in her workshop, finishing a design that had sat untouched for weeks. It wasn't a fortress. It wasn't a retreat. It was a greenhouse, simple, functional, built to last. She filed the permit that evening under her own name, with her own hand, and scanned the signed form into her system, just as she had always done. When the confirmation arrived 3 days later, stamped and validated, she felt nothing dramatic. No surge of triumph, no catharsis. Just a quiet, steady satisfaction that this time it was real, and that no one could touch it without permission. And no one ever tried again.